Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, there was actually a very popular interview. I don't think it went viral, but it gets about as many hits as interviews on that channel particularly get. And this was an interview that happened on a channel, on the show, I should probably say, called The Breakfast Club. Now, on The Breakfast Club, they are an urban American radio station, and they typically interview people who have appeal or who are prominent amongst African Americans in the country. And of course, they interviewed none other than the notorious Dr. Umar Johnson. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this very colorful individual, Dr. Umar Johnson is what I would call the prophet of Pan-Africanism. He is someone who believes that all black people have the same struggle, even if there are different variations to their sameness. They have the same struggle by virtue of them simply being of a single skin color, and Pan-Africanism doubles that principle up and says by virtue of you simply having a heritage in a continent that you may or may not have ever stepped foot into, you should therefore feel obligated and bound towards some sort of metaphysical, mystical bond that you have with your skin color. That is the ideology that is propagated by Dr. Umar Johnson, and we'll discuss why that ideology is philosophically impotent and corrupt in a moment. But this interview had a few key points that I wanted to address directly, and I will not, this is like an hour-long interview. I'm not going to go through all of it, because a lot of it is simply a lot of minutia, and this video is not big enough, or will not be big enough to address all of these points. So I'm going to hit on a few key points, and I'm going to get into why I think Pan-Africanism is a very dangerous ideology. Umar is very notorious for talking about conspiracy theories or making conspiratorial statements. Like, for example, he recently said that the Democratic Party doesn't care about black folks. It cares more about Asian folks because they passed an Asian hate crimes bill, the first one that ever came up in the history of the country, and they had not passed about 100 or so anti-lynching bills that have come through Congress. Take a look.
And the Voting Rights Act in '65, they included two words at the end of that. One was gender, and the other was sexual orientation. So the Civil Rights Bill did not only apply to blacks, it applied to everybody. So if you have to make laws for all Americans, Charlamagne and Envy, how do you explain the fact that the Asian Americans got a law just for them? Yesterday, the United States Senate, in historic precedence, passed the anti-Asian hate crimes bill at a vote of 96-1. Now, to give you an idea of what that means, the Senate, they don't agree on nothing. The Democrats and Republicans, they filibuster each other to death. But yesterday they didn't. 96, only one person voted against the anti-Asian hate crimes bill. So can I ask you a question? If the Senate was able to pass the anti-Asian hate crimes bill, Charlamagne and Envy, 96-1 with almost no opposition, why is it that the Emmett Till lynching bill still has not been approved? Why is it that there have been over 200 different anti-lynching bills introduced in the U.S. Congress? 200! And not one of them has been approved by the U.S. Congress yet. But the first ever Asian bill goes through on the first try. Look at the racism.
So, this is a statement that is being used, I think, to lead to some misleading propositions. Number one, political conditions are almost always driven by events that happen in any given society. So the fact that there was there were a lot of things going on with Asian Americans, particularly there was the spa shooting in Atlanta. The fact that happened, even though that was decidedly not a hate crime, it was a manifestation of an individual's inability to deal with his own sexual imbalance. But let's not talk about that, all right? Despite the fact that was not a hate crime, that was burnt into the mind of the American populace as certainly a hate crime, and emotions are running raw, passions are running raw, which is why and there's an administration that is sympathetic to the ideology which posed that event was a hate crime. So politically they were able to advance forward that notion, and they had overwhelming support. That's true. That does not necessarily mean, however, that there are people or politicians that hate black folks and don't care about black folks because they didn't pass a different set of bills to advance a different set of agendas. Anti-lynching bills, the reason why they have trouble is because they're typically advocated for by people who are on the far left who have a certain idea, a certain conception of the law in relation to black people. Not that it should be equal and it should apply fairly and justly to everyone, but that there is still a vulnerability that black folks have to certain ideologies and certain ideas of the past. A lot of the people who supported anti-lynching bills ignored the laws that were already on the books that that punish such an action already. And this is part of the reason why Rand Paul was against the anti-lynching bills, not because he was against the black folks, but because he thinks that it was redundant and it took away from the actual real work of reforming the police so that all Americans, black or white, doesn't matter, all Americans are not having their rights stepped upon by the jackboot of a police state. And he wanted to end qualified immunity, he wanted to end civil asset forfeiture, but the progressives were not interested in doing that. They were interested in advancing their ideology, their simplified understanding of the world through legislation. Umar Johnson is not interested in the nuances and the niceties of the reasons as to why anti-lynching bills have been rejected. He simply wants to paint the picture that African people or African American people or people of that descent are constantly under increased peril and that the system does not care about them. Well, the system or the state cares about one thing, Umar, and it's power. They don't care what race you are. They don't care what color you are. If the state can maintain its hold on power, that's what it cares about. This is not a race issue. This is a power issue. But it's not a power issue in the sense that you think it is. And we'll get to that in a moment. So he does talk about the idea of power and how apparently Biden and other people are using Asian folks to oppress black folks. So take a listen.
And why are they catering to the Asians? You know why? Because the amount of white people in this country is shrinking.
That's right.
And whenever the amount of white people in America shrinks, America looks to find other white groups or other minority groups that they can build an alliance with to protect their power and their interests. Who better than the Asians? They're just as conservative politically as many middle-class white Americans. They are just as economically comfortable as many middle-class white Americans. They don't like black people just as much as many middle-class white Americans. Not to mention that this can go a long way towards building relationships with Asian countries on the continent of Asia.
So he makes a few claims here. He claims that Asian folks are just as conservative as white people, just to hate black folks as much as white people in our political pawns because there's a lot of geopolitics going on in Europe and in now Southeast Asia and Asia in general. So there are a few things wrong with this claim. Number one, he's generalizing, which should just be very obvious to any of you. But number two, he's assuming that you can understand the interest and conditions of people predicated upon stereotypical versions of them. And he's also trying to apply a set of values to a group, which is impossible necessarily because groups are abstractions, meaning they're not necessarily things that are always concrete and solid. The ideas of groups, so rather, are abstractions. So for Umar Johnson, he can simply say, okay, Asian folks here, we're going to make these Asian folks go up here. I'm going to define them like this, and I'm going to use that for my own purposes. And this, of course, rejects the notion of concrete reality. This, of course, rejects the variation in thought that exists in the Asian American diaspora in America and elsewhere. And this simply is nothing more than a stereotypical idea of how they act. Also, he assumes that all white folks are racist without any core evidence to that assumption. That is also fundamentally incorrect, and it seems very prejudicial in its own right. He then talks about the Ma'Khia Bryant shooting very briefly, and let's play that for a moment.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want nobody to tell me that the police would justify.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, I got you, but the five, her.
Mm-hmm. So the Ma'Khia Bryant shooting, let's be very clear. This girl had a knife. She had called the police, allegedly. She had gotten away from the woman who was attacking her. The police arrive. She has a knife. She goes towards the girl in the pink jumpsuit. She tries to stab her. The police shoot her. They terminate the threat. All the cop knew at that moment was that there was someone with a knife attacking someone else, and that was what they were informed of initially as well. So instead of actually getting down into the dirt and understanding the nuances of these issues, Umar Johnson once again uses the principle of abstraction to try to assign a particular condition or a particular value to people on the basis of their skin color, and then use that to engage in social analysis. But social analysis is so much more dynamic than that. You have to consider variables. You have to consider this. You have to consider that. But there's no room for that in Umar Johnson's philosophy, because it's not a philosophy of truth. It's a philosophy of grievance. Let's keep going on. He mentions that it is acceptable in America to kill black people. Now, I don't know what America Umar Johnson lives in, but let's play this.
Because number one, it's acceptable in America for police to kill blacks. That's number one. And number two, he can afford to isolate conservative Democrats and middle-of-the-road Republicans as it relates to him getting approved all the legislation he wants to get carried over during his presidency.
Okay, so whenever there is even an encounter with a police officer who is white and someone who is black, there are cries of racism without even getting the full story. I don't understand where he is deriving this proposition from, that it is acceptable in America for the police to kill blacks. There were cities across the nation burning, lit aflame all last summer. Cities who didn't even have anything to do with the George Floyd case, simply because people were aggrieved. People were aggrieved, and they had an image of injustice in their mind that they universalized to every single aspect of American society, to every single aspect of American and Black American existence, because George Floyd happened. Yes, there are indeed things that need to change about the police system, but have nothing to do with race and everything to do with how police are able to wield their power, what they're able to do under the color of law. But my point is this: whenever there's even an encounter, whenever there's even an utterance of that encounter, it's automatically assumed that racism is afoot. Does that sound like a society in which it is acceptable for police to kill black folks? And instead, in athwart statistical evidence that show that white folks have more tense encounters with the police than black folks do, athwart all of that, Umar Johnson makes this claim, because once again, Umar Johnson is not engaging in the very real concrete stuff of reason and truth. He is engaging in an abstraction. I'm going to explain that in a moment. Then he really exposes who he is when he says this.
Yeah, I do disagree. A lot of people made demands of Biden, but then you had other people saying...
No. Not people, Charlamagne, as a community.
Well, that's hard, though, because black people aren't monolithic. We can never get on the same page.
Asians aren't monolithic, but they can still organize and put a platform out.
Charlamagne says, no, we're not a monolith. It's not about being a monolith. It's about being a community. It's about having a sort of a unified struggle for something. On the basis of what, though, Umar? Unified struggles are simply statements of values, but it is impossible to assign a singular version of a statement of value to a group of people, because groups themselves have variations. There is not even a single statement of value in organizations that come together for a particular thing. The Republican Party, as evidenced by its history in the past few years, in the past few months, is a fractured party. There are people who support the president, former president. There are people who don't support the former president. There are people who support BLM, who don't support BLM, because variation is simply a part of the structure of reality. There's variation to everything, and that axiom applies indeed to a community. Even if there are people who are in the same genre of the same cause, there is variation to their opinions. Look no further than Malcolm X and MLK. They were allegedly a part of the black struggle, but what does that mean, though? For King, it was a spiritual thing. For King, it was about reinforcing the promise of the Constitution through progressive legislation. And for X, it was about militancy, black separatism, all that kind of stuff. They were in the same genre. They had the same, I guess, foundational basis, but they got there through very, very different ways. Umar Johnson, by his language, rejects the principle of variation, which is essential to understand any concept in its truest form. So he is laboring in falsehood. He is laboring in falsehood. But speaking of this community thing, he mentioned something here about black women and homosexuality. I want you to watch it.
I'll benefit the black struggle. And as black women, y'all got to check yourselves, and I'm going to tell you why. There ain't enough black men to go around for y'all as it is.
It's true.
Homosexuality seeks to drive that number even lower. How can a black woman not have a position on a lifestyle
that's going to make it even more difficult for our daughters to get married. I got 2 girls myself.
Okay.
One day they got to get married. If this gay rate keep on going the way it's going, will there be any men for my daughters? So for black women, I often tell them, how can you on one hand complain about not enough good black men going around, and then on the other hand, you hanging out with 25 gay male friends? That's a contradiction.
So he says, how in the world can you not have an opinion about something that endangers your ability to have a husband? So first of all, he assumes that all black women have the same kind of an orientation. That's not correct. Second of all, he also assumes that he assumes that there is this unified black struggle, which he has not really established through anything but an appeal to complexion, to skin complexion. And I'm sorry, but an appeal to skin complexion is not descriptive. The problem about race, my friends, race is an inherently undescriptive thing. It's not descriptive. What we do is we import all these values, we import all these ideas, and we impose them onto the race of the person, and we think that they're supposed to do that. Like, that's why I used to get told that I was acting white, right? When I was in grade school and I was speaking proper, I used to get told that because there are people who had, through their understanding of race, imposed a certain set of activities towards white people that I was supposedly exhibiting. But the problem is, race has no inherent activity to it. It is entirely a social category. It is not simply a social construction. It is ultimately an illusion because it tells me nothing meaningful about myself. Now, Umar would probably say, what about your culture, Christian? What about my culture? Culture is a choice, my friend. I have no control over the culture that I'm born in, but I have every bit of control over the culture that I decide to exist in. So I'm not bound to a certain culture by my skin color. And when you say Pan-Africanism, you were talking about a lot of things there. You're talking about Egyptians, talking about Ethiopians, talking about South Africans, talking about a lot of things there that, again, all reflect the principle of variation, which Umar Johnson, buying through his ideology and buying through his arguments, absolutely eschews and rejects. So the real question here becomes, what is the root of these fallacious claims? What is the root of all of this? So there is a theorist called Frances Cresswell, who was also one of these black feminist people, Afrocentrists back in the 80s. She wrote, and I quote, this is a quote of what she wrote, she identified that a lack of male role models in black families with homosexuality, a condition she believed was white-imposed attempt to control black people by spreading a sexual identity that precluded reproduction. That's essentially the same idea that Umar Johnson is postulating. And the logical problem with that idea is very simple, my friends. Just because a thing is black adjacent, it is adjacent to color, does not mean it is inherently concerned with color. So just because they're African Americans who are homosexual does not necessarily mean that homosexuality has anything to do with their color, or that it has anything to do with the condition of their color in society, whether it's with families or whatever the heck. It doesn't mean that. Unless you interpret it that way. But logically, there is no through line between those two things. So this leads us to the problems with Afrocentrism, my friends. Afrocentrism essentializes race and the land. For Umar Johnson, it's very important for black folks to understand where they come from, essentially, even if they've never actually been to Africa. It makes their skin complexion and the land which they supposedly are hailing from the whole of their values, of their interests, of their lives, of their struggle. And that is an emaciated, a broken down, a disturbed view of man. Because man is much more than the land he inhabits. Man is much more than his ability to form unions or bonds, although the ability to form unions and bonds are important. But even for Pan-Africanists, the unions and bonds are based on something that is not subject necessarily to the idea of consent, but obligation. Man is much more than obligations that usurp and go outside of his ability to choose for things for himself. Man is a rational, intelligent creature which has done so many things on the basis of discovery, on the basis of so many other ideas other than race, other than culture, and has made the world not his footstool, but has made the world his oyster. But for Umar, he essentializes all of that, forgets the majesty of man, and appends it all to race. The Afrocentrist also imports the ideas of the past into the present and assumes that the past must necessarily affect the present. They are, in that sense, they are binding themselves to the false idea that tradition is what everything is. It's the traditional fallacy. Just because it happened there, it must have happened here. Again, there's no connection between the two, though. They assume that because, and for Pan-Africanists, they really put an emphasis on colonialism and slavery and how that shapes systems of power that African Americans are involved in. They believe that those conditions of the past are inherently bound to the existence of the present. But the problem is, there's no inherent connection between the two. There's no logical connection, because you can simply look at things like police brutality, and you can try to assume that they have some sort of connection to oppression, without actually doing the work of looking at something independent of the ideology. You're failing. The problem with Pan-Africanism is not that it hails Africans. It's that it views everything through the lens of race. It views everything through the lens of geography. And it has a very narrow, confined understanding of history. It doesn't allow us to explore beyond the reaches of our ideology. If an ideology confines you to a very narrow understanding of the world, that ideology is not worth anything, my friends. It's simply going to lead you to falsehood. John Stuart Mill says we have to combine discourse with experience. But for the Pan-Africanist, experience is very special and hidden and bound inside of us on the basis of this, on the basis of our skin color. So you can't do what Mill would say and combine discourse with experience. You can't do that with Pan-Africanism. And of course, this leads to my third point. It ultimately eschews argumentation by basically invalidating the opinions of other individuals like white folks, by relying on alleged power dynamics. In that sense, Pan-Africanism is very much similar to critical race theory, in that it links the destinies of people of African descent towards those of power, even if those of power are held by them, because the system, according to these people, is the problem. Umar Johnson is someone who I think is incredibly dangerous to the advancement of any individual, but particularly black individuals, because those are his target audience. And I think that it behooves us, if we are going to pursue reason and pursue the values of the Enlightenment and pursue truth, to fight against a lot of what he says, to fight against these principles respectfully, and to make sure that African Americans understand they are more than their alleged heritage, they are more than their alleged descent, and they are more than their race. They are brilliant and special and spiritual human beings who have so much to offer this world beyond the outside. Think on it. As always, my friends, I love you, and if you want to support me, you know where to do it. Patreon or PayPal. Patreon.com/VigilCWatson. I love you, and please, as always, stay pensive.